Welcome to Built to Go, a van life podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Wagg, coming to you from the College of Curiosity and the hotel from The Shining. This is episode 96. Thank you very much for tuning in. This time we're going to talk about not only this amazing hotel, but also what it was like to grow up in Salem, Massachusetts. Some things you may want to keep in mind if you're going to take your van out in the winter. And we're going to talk about what you should do when you get chips in your windshield. So, here we go. Now we're going to talk about glass in this episode, but I want you to take a look at this thing right here and think about what this might be. I'll explain it at the end of the video because it's kind of cool. And so far as I know, the only place in the world these exist is at the Timberline Lodge. Here's what it looks like from a distance. And yes, you can adjust it here, and I assume it comes off too. But anyway, I'll tell you what it is at the end. I'm sitting beside a very nice warm fire because, folks, winter is coming. And are you ready for it? Are you maybe someone who has spent all this time down south in your van and you're not really sure what to expect when you come north? And do come north. Winter in a van is a very special time. But let's talk about some things you need to be careful about if you're going to venture into the snowier climes. Did you know that there are different kinds of diesel fuel and that some of them don't like the cold? Yeah, this has been a big problem for truckers for years. They're in southern Texas and they fill up and get 400 gallons of fuel, and then they drive north and there's a snowstorm, and then suddenly, well, their diesel fuel has turned into a gel and can no longer be pumped to the engine, and they're stuck. Well, this can happen to you too, and while your van isn't likely to carry 400 gallons of diesel fuel, you may have some diesel in your diesel heater's tank or some diesel you got down south, and you don't want that stuff to get cold. Now, if you have diesel that you're going to be keeping around for a while, you might want to get a diesel treatment added to it. These prevent gelling, and they also prevent algae from growing in there, which is another problem diesel can have. So as long as you go through your diesel regularly, you're going to be fine. But if you're going to spend time up north, make sure you bought your diesel up north too, because it will be a winter formula that won't gel. So obviously you've got liquids in your van, and a problem is that they freeze. And you know, the big tank filled with water, most people realize I have to do something about that. And the traditional thing to do is to replace the water with propylene glycol. That's the pink RV antifreeze stuff. It's good stuff, it's safe, it's very effective, and don't ever mistake it for ethylene glycol. That's the antifreeze you put in your radiator. Don't do that, that is bad. But there's one place a lot of people forget, and that is their toilets. Depending on what kind of a toilet you have in your van, it may use fresh water for flushing, and sometimes it's really hard to get that fresh water out, and there's little tiny spaces in there that can freeze and destroy your toilet. And, well, we don't want that. So this is a trick I've used for cassette toilets, which have a fresh water reservoir. One thing you can do is to fill that reservoir with RV antifreeze, or to save some money, you can use windshield washer fluid, which is like $1.25 a gallon. And the great thing about this is you can then continue to use the toilet even though it's freezing, because that windshield washer fluid won't freeze. And if you flush the toilet, well, what's going into the bottom of the toilet is also a large amount of windshield washer fluid. So you don't have any worries at all about any of those fragile pieces breaking because it froze. I've done this for years. It works fine. It won't harm your seals. So this is a +1 for cassette toilets in the winter. You will have fewer problems with them than some of the other methods. Of course, if you're using the bucket method, well, it's kind of hard for anything to go wrong. I know what you're thinking. It's cold out, right? So you want to make heat inside the van. You want to shut up all the windows and shut your vents and keep all that heat inside because you don't want it to escape. You know that big max air fan you have on the roof? You wouldn't want to leave that open and let all the heat out. Well, yes, you do. Not all the heat. But ventilation is super important in the winter. And okay, maybe you didn't get a buddy heater that pumps moisture into the air. Maybe you got a diesel heater that blows a nice dry heat. But you know what? It doesn't matter because you exhale moisture. When you cook, there's moisture. When you're just in the van, there's moisture. And that moisture will find the cold spots in your van, which are there no matter how well you insulate it, will condense and then drip down and pool somewhere. and then a little bit of mold will find that spot and grow and have a happy new home and make your life miserable. So, ventilation is very important in the winter. Crack those vents, leave that fan on super low, but make sure there is some airflow. And remember, it's easy to make way more heat than you can stand in the van. So let some of it out. It's okay. Now, it's just a simple element of physics here that when things get cold, they kind of condense, they get smaller. There's less pressure, and this is especially true of air, and air in your tires. So very often when the weather gets cold, you'll find that your tire pressure monitor light goes on, and well, it's not that big of a deal. It just means you want to pump up your tires, but just a little bit, because as you're driving, that air will warm up naturally and resume its normal pressure. So don't go inflating them to the maximum pressure while they're very, very cold, because then you could actually end up with an overpressure situation. Just every fall when things start to get cold, add just enough air to get that light to go off. And remember, sometimes you have to drive it around for a bit for that light to go off. If that light comes on and you walk around your van and the wheels look like they're fine, you're probably fine. You probably don't have any other problem. But this is something that happens to me almost every winter, and I thought I'd save you a little heartache just to let you know it's not that big of a deal. Don't forget that food can freeze too. Now, I like to keep a good amount of food in my van just so I have something to eat, even if I've forgotten about it. I have a lot of canned foods, a lot of shelf-stable foods, but some of those are liquid, and yeah, they will freeze. And this is maybe something you haven't thought about if you've only gone van camping down south. But yeah, you could have a frozen can of tuna, which isn't the end of the world, it just kind of gets puffy. Or you could have a frozen 6-pack of Coke, which is bad. Ask your friends up north what has happened that one time they left a can of Coke in the car. Imagine a hand grenade going off, except it's made of Coke. It's really not a good scene. So when you're preparing your van for the winter, keep in mind that a lot of those food items can also freeze, and you should probably avoid the ones that have a lot of moisture or a lot of water content. Remember also that batteries act a little bit differently in the winter. If you have traditional AGM or lead acid batteries, well, they'll just work less well. They basically lose power in the cold. Some lead acid batteries, the kind you have to add water to every so often, they can actually freeze. So you want to keep them out of extreme cold. But in general, if you have AGM batteries, you can just use them as normal. Just keep in mind that they're not going to be quite as strong, and of course you're not going to be getting very much solar power at all, so you're going to have to find another way to charge them. Now if you have lithium batteries, they actually perform quite well in the cold, with one big exception. Lithium batteries do not like to be charged below freezing. In fact, you can cause permanent damage to your lithium batteries if you just, say, give them a little solar charge when it's 30 degrees out. You have to be very careful about this. Now, if you purchased good quality brand name lithium batteries like Battleborn or Renogy or something like that, their BMS battery management system probably has a low temperature cutoff that will prevent the batteries from being charged in such conditions. But if you bought the cheaper batteries like the Chins or the Ampere Time like I did, yeah, that's not there. You are responsible for making sure those things don't charge when the temperature gets below freezing. Now, in a future video, I'm going to talk about how you can put a heating pad on there to help mitigate that, but it's something you really have to pay attention to, and it only takes one time to cause permanent damages to your batteries. So lithium's great, but this is the Achilles heel. One thing you'll notice when you're camping in really cold weather is that you're likely to have thermal layers in your van. It's going to be very possible for you to sit in your van having breakfast and have your feet be freezing and your head be too hot. It's just how it is when you're heating these small spaces. It's a very strange phenomenon, and there's not all that much you can do about it. Sure, you can put your heater down low and have the heat rise, which is a good thing, and you can have some fans blowing stuff around in there, and that helps too. You're basically always going to have a cold floor, no matter how well you insulate. With one exception. If you're super fancy, you can put heating in the floor. You can put in a heated floor, basically, whether it be hydronic or some form of electric. But that's fancier than I'm ever going to be and a little bit more complex than I think I'd like to tackle. But hey, if you've got the chops, go for it, and you can have nice warm feet in the winter. One plus to the winter, or one thing you can do in the winter, is check your insulation. And you can do this with one of those thermometers, those little laser gun thermometers. You can basically heat up your van and then go outside and see which parts of the van on the outside are hot. Those are the places that need more insulation. Or if you want to be super fancy, you can get one of those FLIR cameras that attaches to your cell phone and just take a picture of your van. And the cold spots will show up and the hot spots will show up. And those hot spots are the places where you need more insulation. Now, like I've said many times, don't freak out about insulation. It isn't as big a deal as people make it. But if you have a big gap somewhere that's easy to access, go ahead and add some more insulation. It won't hurt. And maybe the biggest piece of advice I can give, and it's really super important, have a financial buffer. Look, if you break down in the summer and you can't have access to your van, sure, you can stay in a tent for a few nights and it's not a big deal. But if it's in the winter and it's 20 degrees below zero, you're going to have to stay somewhere inside. And that means you're either going to have to pay for a hotel or you're going to have to travel somewhere, and that's going to take money. So before you head out in the winter in your van, make sure you have a buffer so that if something bad happens, you're safe. Being alone in a van in the winter without any money is a bad thing. Don't let that happen to you. Absolutely keep money in the bank. And heck, if you don't use it, well, nobody has ever minded having too much money in the bank. Tech Talk. Let's talk about windshield chips. I know, always the exciting topics on this show, but this is kind of an important one. If you drive enough, eventually you're going to get a chip in your windshield. A rock's going to bounce off the road and hit your windshield, and then, well, you got a little star on there that you didn't have before. Now, much of the time, those stars are just annoying, and yeah, they can be in your way of your line of sight and whatever, but they're actually a little bit more than that, because they don't always stay that way. Sometimes they can spread, especially when you're changing temperatures. If you leave your car out in the hot sun or you take it into a cold climate, those cracks can spread. And I've had that happen where a little crack that I've ignored for maybe 6 months suddenly goes all over the windshield. Okay, first off, you should know that these things aren't dangerous. Your windshield isn't going to collapse on you. It's not going to fall in the car. It's not going to suddenly become this crazed spider web you can't see through. Car windshields are made of 2 pieces of glass, tempered glass, glass that does not break into sharp pieces. And in between them is a piece of plastic. It's called a laminate glass, and it's super strong. Windshields are actually pretty high tech. You could not throw a rock through a windshield. It wouldn't go through. And that's a really good thing if you're driving and a rock happens to hit your windshield. But what do you do if you get one of these cracks? The number one best thing is to have comprehensive insurance that will pay to have you take your van to a commercial shop where they will properly fill it with a vacuum system and resin and all this. And in many cases, they can actually make it go away. You won't even see it anymore. This isn't just for cosmetic reasons. It prevents those cracks from spreading, and so oftentimes this is free. If you have comprehensive insurance from a major insurer, they will probably do this for free. Even if they don't, it doesn't cost all that much money. But I get it. You're a van person. You're in your van. You have places to go, things to do, and you might be 300 miles from the nearest glass repair shop. I totally get that. So the number 2 best thing you can do is to buy a windshield repair kit. Now, these are a little bit hard to find locally, but you can get them online. And they're basically a syringe and some of that same resin. You attach it to your windshield in a very complicated way, and the syringe pushes that resin into the crack, thus permanently sealing it. You probably won't get as good a job as a professional would do, but it's still pretty good. And if any of that little resin leaks out and leaves a bump on the windshield, you just take a razor blade and shave that off and you're fine. I've done this. It works. The most important thing, though, is it prevents the crack from spreading. Now, okay, you're not as prepared as that, right? And you're thinking, well, I just should have bought one, but I didn't, and now I've got this big crack. What do I do? Okay. One thing to keep in mind is you do not want water to get into these cracks. Don't put on the washer fluid or any of that. As soon as you get that crack, try to fix it as soon as possible. And a thing you can fix it with if you do not have the proper repair kit is, of course, super glue. So one thing you could do is buy a container of gel super glue. Right there, see, gel super glue? Gel super glue is the perfect thing for fixing these windshields, and it is not as good as the other methods, but it works and it will prevent the glass from cracking. Now, super glue is tricky stuff to deal with. It hardens really fast, it's easy to get on your fingers, and you will probably get some on the windshield where you don't want it. Well, again, with the razor blade, you have to get out there and scrape that off, but you have to actually do it pretty well because don't forget, in most of your windshield, the wipers are going to go across. And if there's a bump there, the wipers hit that bump and it kind of messes up your wipers, and at the very least, it makes them not do a very good job. So don't panic if you get one of these cracks. Everybody does. It's completely a normal part of driving a vehicle. I've had probably a dozen over the years. And basically carry some super glue gel and you can fix it yourself. Tales from the road. So it's true, I grew up in Salem, Massachusetts, the Witch City. And given that Halloween's coming up, I thought I might talk about the experience of growing up in such a haunted place. Well, the truth is that I grew up there in the 70s and 80s, and in the 70s, the town was trying to downplay its witchcraft heritage. Now, the town was founded in 1626, and what has been called the witch hysteria happened in 1692. But let's not forget what that event was. That was the government, people's neighbors, and the church all coming together to persecute basically undesirables in the community. It was not a happy event, and that's what makes the current celebrations known as haunted happenings a little bit troubling. Now, Salem is not shy about its witch heritage and really never was in my lifetime. I went to Witchcraft Heights Elementary School and know that isn't some kind of modern Hogwarts. That's just the name of the development I grew up in. Witchcraft Heights was a sprawl of 1970s raised ranch houses, and they just named the elementary school after the area. But it was a little bit quirky. We had streets named things like Witch Way, that's Witch Way, Cauldron Court, Crescent Circle, all these kind of names that evoke this Halloween imagery that the town now really subscribes to. But I promise you the curriculum was just plain old normal elementary school stuff. We did not learn any witchcraft at the Witchcraft Heights Elementary School. The high school, the mascot for the football team is the Salem Witch. They have a witch at their football games, and that's not too surprising because the name of the team is the Salem Witches. The masthead of the newspaper, the Salem Evening News, is a witch flying across the moon. And even on policemen's uniforms, you will see on their patches an image of a witch flying across the moon. And perhaps the most poignant and most important to me was the fact that we didn't have a Dairy Queen, we had a Dairy Witch. That's right, our little ice cream place was the Dairy Witch, and everybody would go there after baseball games, and I consumed countless calories there. The sign was a giant ice cream cone with a ladder and a witch climbing up it. And being a kid, I didn't think anything of this. I thought this was normal. Now, we did go on field trips, of course, and Salem has a number of world-class museums, like the Peabody Museum and the Essex Institute. We have a National Maritime Center. The truth is that Salem should be a famous city because there's a lot that happened there that was the very first time things like this had happened in the United States. Salem had the first millionaire. Salem had the first elephant in North America. Salem has the oldest candy company in the country. The first public demonstration of a telephone call happened in Salem, and so on and so on. These things go on and on and on. Salem is an absolutely wonderful place. But perhaps one thing I didn't appreciate as a kid was just how special Halloween was there. We did traditional trick-or-treating, and that seems to be becoming something of a rarity these days. We went all through Witchcraft Heights dressed as witches and collected pillowcases filled with candy, and many of them were the full-size bars. And a lot of people really got into it. In fact, some of the houses in our community were painted orange and black to try to fit in with this theme. Now, all that said, I could speak for hours about the history of this witch hysteria, which is not a great term for what actually happened. What actually happened was the persecution of vulnerable people. And most of those people didn't even live in what we call today Salem. Salem town, what we think of today as the city of Salem, was where the trials happened. But the people, the accused, lived in surrounding areas, and I'll use the local pronunciation here. They lived in Peabody, and Danvers, and Andover, and Beverly. Now, Back then, those places were called things like Salem Village and Salem Fields and Salem Farms, and that's what they thought of as Salem way back then. So while the city of Salem gets all the fame these days, a lot of the events and a lot of the people actually lived in the surrounding towns. Now, if you are interested in checking out Salem, next year in 2022, I am going to be organizing a trip there. I'm hoping to get some van life folks to join me, and there is an amazing place to park your van there. It's a paid campground, but it's on an island in Salem Harbor, and it has crazy history. But don't just go to Salem for haunted happenings and think that's what it's all about. Salem has really embraced this imagery, and they've basically gone commercial and tried to rake every penny they can out of Halloween-obsessed fans. But there's a lot more there under the surface. Don't go there in October. Go there during June and see all the wonderful things. I feel very privileged to have grown up there, but I think the image that a lot of people get about Salem, Massachusetts isn't exactly what's going on. It's truly far more interesting. A place to visit. Well, shockingly, I'm going to tell you to come visit the Timberline Lodge because I'm sitting in it right now. Timberline Lodge was built in 1937 by the Works Progress Administration, which was part of FDR's effort to combat the Great Depression. Local artisans, construction workers, stonemasons, iron workers, basically anybody with a skill that could be used to build such a fantastic lodge was put to work for well over a year. And they had to work in some unusual conditions because they were halfway up the tallest mountain in the state of Oregon. But I think you'll agree that what they accomplished is truly astonishing. It is called the Timberline for a very specific reason. At 6,000 feet, it is at the timberline of the mountain. There really aren't too many trees above this point. And by the way, 6,000 feet is just a little bit more than halfway up Mount Hood. This is a serious mountain. Now, this place was built to be a ski resort, and in fact it is. It is the only ski resort in the U.S. that can operate 12 months a year. Now, that doesn't mean that it's always open 12 months a year. Of course, the snow matters. But if there's snow, they will be open 12 months a year. As it happens right now, even though it's snowing like crazy outside, they're not open for skiing yet. But they have modern lifts and a modern ski lodge building, but they also have this old historic lodge that is just wonderful. Now, yes, this is the lodge from the movie The Shining, the Stanley Kubrick movie, but there is nothing inside that has anything to do with the movie. The inside is totally different. Basically, Kubrick took the outside of this lodge and took the inside of a lodge at Yosemite and combined them to make his fantastical overlook. By the way, there is no room 237 here at the Timberline. There is a door 235, but you see it just is a kitchen. If you're wondering why I haven't mentioned Stephen King here, it's because his building was actually the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park, which has nothing to do with any of these. So which lodge was The Shining? Well, you can pick any one of the three depending on your perspective. But this one is the iconic building that everyone will associate with the Overlook. And it is unbelievable. Everything is built large and strong and out of wrought iron and the most amazingly huge wood beams you have ever seen. There are beams in this building that are holding up the main roof that I can't even guess how big they are, but it would probably take 5 people with their arms stretched to wrap around it. They're so big. There is no way they could build anything like this today. The trees simply don't exist. Everywhere you look, there's some little hand-carved thing or wrought iron thing, and the scale is really something to appreciate. So this fire is almost always going, and there's a couple of cool things about the fire. So these here, these giant andirons, are actually bent rails from a railway, train rails, and they hand bent these. And these chains here are actually used snow tire chains from trucks back in the 30s, and that's how old this stuff is. So that's pretty cool. here's the answer to the puzzle here, what this thing is. These windows are, at the time, when this place was built in 1937, they were the largest plate glass windows that could be made. They're actually huge, but the wind was pretty bad, and it would blow the windows in on some really bad days. So they constructed these to keep the windows in place. Now, today's windows are double pane, you can see here. So yeah, they're more decorative than anything, but they're still pretty darn cool. And if you guessed that right, congratulations, you are a smart person. If you are ever in Oregon, especially even if you're near Portland, this isn't that far away. It's well worth it to take a trip up here. Maybe have dinner in the dining room when it's not COVID times, things are weird now, or have a drink in the Ram's Head Bar or at the Blue Ox when it's open, which is during the heavy season, and just experience this place and learn a little bit about its history. Timberline Lodge, absolutely wonderful place to stay. No, it's not cheap. Thank you for watching episode 96. I absolutely appreciate every pair of eyeballs I can get. And this time I did something a little different. The podcast and the video have different content. So if you would like to hear something a little different, you can still listen to the podcast. It is Built to Go, a van life podcast. Original music, as always, by Simon Wagg. And until next time, remember the words of Aristotle, who said, "If you wish to experience a snowflake, you must first stand out in the cold."